Hey everyone, and welcome to another tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics. And in today's tutorial we will be learning how to draw tears. Now, in order to draw tears realistically, this will also be a tutorial on how to draw an eye. Obviously, in order to contextualize the tears, we'll have to know how to draw an eye first. So with that being said, let's get into it. Now, using a light pencil, we want to start by just forming a basic shape of the eye. And there's many ways to draw an eye shape, but in this case we'll be focusing on a more classical eye shape. And what is meant by a classical eye shape is an eye that is relatively open, so the eye is not resting too much and is super narrow, but rather kind of wide open. So when we draw the basic outline of the eye, the idea is that we want to imagine it as almost a teardrop shape or a tadpole shape, where we have this kind of enlarged and circular area that becomes quite narrow to a point, and that narrow point is going to establish the corner of the eye. The outer corner of the eye is slightly narrow, but not necessarily as narrow as the inner corner of the eye. So try to think of it as drawing this teardrop shape, or maybe like a tadpole shape or a leaf shape. So what we want to do is we want to basically sketch out this basic teardrop shape, and then we will slowly contextualize it with details. So using our pen, what we can start doing now is we can actually start creating some three-dimensionality by drawing the upper eyelid areas, or the skin that rests over the upper eyelid. And generally the skin of the eye or around the eye kind of flows parallel along the upper eyelid. And this is going to kind of establish that bulge of how the eye comes out of the face. So it's really important for us to already start thinking about the three-dimensional sphere-like quality of the eyeball and how it rests behind these little moments of skin, such as the eyelid or the skin that rests on top of the eyelid. But that being said, we can also start moving on to adding in some other features. The idea here is to slowly build up the eye with a light sketch and slowly refine these details. We can also start putting in the upper eyelashes that rest just on the upper eyelid and slightly curve outward and upward as it arches down towards the outer corner of the eye. We can also start adding in other features like the caruncle or the semilunaris, and these are these little details in the inner corner of the eye near the tear ducts. We can also start adding in some slight parallel lines that flow along the bottom eyelid, really close towards the bottom eyelid, to start giving the bottom eyelid a little bit more three-dimensionality. As we proceed, we can also start drawing in the iris and the pupil. With the iris, something to consider is even when eyes are open, the upper eyelid is slightly rested. So what's happening is the iris is kind of this circular structure that falls slightly behind the upper eyelid. So the idea is that we're always drawing a circle that is cut off like 20% at the top because it's covered by the upper eyelid. Take your time using your pencil and eraser to draw in this perfect circular structure that kind of is slightly placed behind the upper eyelid, or is slightly covered by the upper eyelid at about a 20% ratio to the entire iris. Now again, obviously we can place the iris wherever we like in the eye, but to keep things simple, let's try to keep the iris quite central in the eye, as this is obviously going to make things slightly easier. Now again, we are just focusing on drawing the eye at this point. We can also start drawing in the pupil. We don't necessarily need to draw in the pupil too large to keep the eye quite neutral. We just want to draw a smaller circle within the iris itself, and this is going to establish the pupil. Now, when it comes to drawing tears, the idea is that what we're trying to achieve is a more glossy effect in the eye, and the reason for this is because obviously when an eye starts to well up with tears, it starts to develop a lot of moisture along the already glassy surface of the eye, but this very shiny or reflective water-like layer over the eye causes a lot of refraction of light or reflections along the surface of the eyeball. And the way in which we're going to represent this is we're just going to proceed by drawing in details of the eye as if we weren't drawing a teary eye at all. So what we want to start doing now is we want to start drawing in details into the iris, but as we do so, we're going to draw in these little shapes that are going to establish negative spaces within the eye. So proceed now with drawing in some detailing in the iris. This is where we can be a little bit playful with how we represent features in the iris. There's many ways to draw in that very unique iris-like quality. You can play around with almost galaxy-like shapes, but the idea to really capture a more realistic iris quality is to utilize your line work. So this is where we want to start using line work that stems outward from the pupil and moves around the pupil inside the iris, as well as along the outline of the iris. So we're basically drawing these lines that connect from the outer rim of the iris to the outer rim of the pupil. As we do this, what we can do is add in more organic shapes to give just an interesting texture to the iris itself. But as we proceed with drawing the iris, what we want to do is we want to draw in these very geometric-like shapes. So the reason we do this is because when an eyeball has this wet, glassy layer over it and it reflects light, often these reflections are very geometric looking. And this is going to have a more realistic, reflective visual aesthetic in the eyeball. Now, at this point, because we are lightly sketching the eye, we can actually start to draw in these water teary shapes along the bottom of the eye. Now, there's many ways to do this, but in order to achieve a more realistic sense of water welling up in the eye, the idea is that we want to work with both a glassy surface over the entire eyeball, as well as these larger water-like structures that are falling. Now, obviously, when tears well up, they obviously gain some weight to them, and gravity pulls them down the face. And what happens is they kind of form a little bit of a body that sits along the bottom eyelid and then eventually fall down the face. Now, the way in which we can represent this in our drawing is we can be a little bit playful with how we draw in the water. Obviously, water takes many forms, but the idea here is to draw this very organic-like structure with very flowy lines that sits along the surface of the lower eyelid. And what happens is then it kind of falls to these teardrop shapes or these bulges, and this is because obviously as water wells up, it sits on the lower eyelid and then eventually falls down to a teardrop shape. So the idea here is we can draw this along the entire lower section of the eye, or the entire lower eyelid. Now, because obviously tears are water and they have a glassy structure, very similar to how we have drawn shapes in the eye itself, we now want to slightly draw in these little shapes in the teardrops themselves. And the idea here is that we're going to shade around these shapes, and this shading and the combination of the shapes as these negative spaces is going to establish a reflective quality in these water-like structures. So using your pencil, really try to add some shading into these water-like structures or these teardrops, but try to keep your shading to one side. The idea here is that we want to create these very small gradients within the watery teardrop structures. So the way water often works as it reflects light is what will happen is light will hit the surface and refract inside the teardrop itself. So what happens is a shadow will be present on one side of a teardrop and will also cast a shadow on the surface that it is on top of. So in this case, the teardrop is on top of the skin below the eye, so it's going to cast a subtle shadow on the skin itself, but then there's also going to be a subtle shadowing in the teardrop itself. In the shadowy areas of the teardrop is where these little shapes are going to remain as negative spaces, and this is going to establish a reflective quality in the teardrops. Now, as we shade in these teardrops, we really just want to keep these shapes untouched. We really just want to make sure that these shapes or these teardrop structures have these little shapes in them that are negative space, and this is just going to help establish a more effective and realistic representation of how light reflects off of these water glassy structures. Again, within the teardrops and the eyeball itself, in order for us to represent a reflection of light off of a glassy surface, we really need to play around with these shapes. These shapes, these negative spaces, are really what are going to put across the reflection of this glassy surface. And this process is going to be applied to not only the teardrops themselves, but to the entire eyeball. So what we'll do now is, working with our pencils, we want to slowly add in some light shading to establish a particular tonal value over the entire eyeball, but whilst carefully just working our way around these shapes in order to just leave them as negative spaces, and therefore to represent these little moments of highlights or reflections on the eyeball. This is where we now can obviously just work with our pencils and spend some time on just drawing in the basic details of the eye as normal. This means the details in the iris, some shading along the sides of the eyeball, but we want to the shift here from just a normal eye drawing to a teary-eye drawing is that the entire eyeball itself, including the teardrops, are going to be shaded in, and our intention is to be more careful and precise with working with negative spaces as a means of creating highlights in here. Now, just to emphasize the structure of teardrops, and how light often interacts with water structures, is light goes through the structure, it still casts a shadow onto the surface that those teardrops are resting on. So there'll be shadowing under each teardrop itself as a three-dimensional structure, but then there'll be a gradient in each teardrop where there'll be a moment of shading that shifts to complete negative space, and then in those little moments of shading we can draw a negative shape to emphasize refraction or reflection of light on the teardrop surface. In order to really create a beautiful, realistic representation of a watery or teary eye, we just want to make sure we take our time. And that's the most important thing, having patience, slowly working in details of the eye that are normal, such as the eyelashes, the eyelid, the tear ducts, the shape of the eye, shading around the eye, skin that rests over the eyelid. All these details, we just want to spend time working in some general shading to establish these features a little more clearly. Obviously, in order for the tears to be contextualized and seem realistic, it needs to coincide with a realistic representation of an eye. So just take your time working in the details of the iris, working in details around the eye before we move on to adding in some darker details with a darker pencil. Now, we should have a general light sketch of a teary eye at this point. And what we now want to do is we want to use this light sketch to guide us as we slowly add in some darker shading with a darker pencil. So maybe using a 6B or 7B, something really dark and soft. We want to start going over these shaded in areas in the eye, and this is simply use our light sketching details to assist us in the process. So we're not now trying to create new features, we're not now trying to create new marks. We can obviously if we feel we need to, but what we should have is a light sketch of a teary eye to assist us or guide us as we add in some darker contrasted shading and detailing. So using a darker pencil, slowly work over maybe outlining the iris, maybe darkening the pupil, going over some of the line work within the iris, or just slowly darkening the shadows within the tears themselves. Now, this we don't need to do too much because we're going to start working with our pens. In particular, ballpoint pen is very similar to working with pencil. It's all a matter of how hard we press, how much pressure we apply to the pen, and the ink kind of comes out quite sparingly, very similar to the way in which we make marks with pencils. Now, again, using our light pencil sketch of our teary-eyed drawing, we now want to move on to using our ballpoint pen, and this is basically where we slowly start to go over all the details that we have already drawn. So Starting from one side of the eye is always a great way to slowly work through the entire drawing of the eye itself. So starting from the inner corner of the eye, we basically want to work over the sketch and the shaded in details and use them to guide us as we fill in the drawing with some more contrasted ballpoint pen detailing. Because ballpoint pen is really dark and quite a soft ink, we really want to make sure we take our time slowly going through all the details of the eye. Again, something to really emphasize, the idea of creating a teary-eyed drawing is that we want to cover the entire eyeball with a darker tonal value, where we leave out these little shapes that we have drawn in as the negative spaces, and these negative spaces will obviously establish the highlights or the little moments of light reflecting off the wet surface of the eye. And as we work with pen, we really want to make sure that we go slowly and really patient. With ballpoint pen, it's also good to keep a scrap piece of paper aside to scribble on if there's any buildup of excess ink before we start applying some pen details or pen shading to the drawing itself. Use the light pencil sketch to really guide your drawing process. Now, with ballpoint pen, it's really helpful actually when we come to more refined detailing in areas that require some fine line work, and this is particularly true for the iris itself. So this is a moment for us to spend time on really enhancing or darkening not only the shadows that are present within the eyeball, but also to add in some darker line work within the iris itself. This is going to slowly emphasize the details of the iris, that unique textural cloudy quality that is unique to an iris in an eyeball, as well as completely darkening the pupil itself. So the pen is also a great way to just darken certain features within the eye, but it is also a great way to lightly go over pencil shading to slowly enhance or add more contrast to the pencil shading itself. Take your time, that's the most important part. Slowly work in details using the pencil sketch as a means of guiding you in your pen shading process. Something important to note with drawing in ballpoint pen, especially for this particular kind of drawing, is that we have a moment here to really emphasize the little geometric shapes that we have drawn within the eyeball near the iris itself. Which is a moment to create a juxtaposition between details of the eye and the negative space or the highlight that is those little geometric structures. So if any little geometric structures overlap onto the iris itself, using your pen to outline those structures and then shade around them is a great way to bring a stark difference between the darker tonal values in the eye itself and then these very light negative moments of refraction or reflection of light along the surface of the eyeball. Another thing to note here with pen is that it's really all just a matter of patience and time. The idea with ballpoint pen, because of how the ink comes out so sparingly, is that we can basically draw in layers. And what I mean by that is we don't necessarily need to completely darken structures. We can slowly, with a soft touch, with very gentle pressure, shade over already shaded in marks made with our pencil, and then slowly go over it again with more pen shading, and so on until we have achieved a particular tone of value that we feel has effectively defined a certain visual quality in the eye. Now, obviously, as we proceed with this process, we can slowly start to add in some pen detailing to the surrounding features as well. And this includes bringing out shadows or shading around the eyelids itself, adding shading to the eyelashes or darkening the eyelashes with our pen marks. Now, something also to consider, obviously, water or tears are a soft structure that the lower eyelashes that sit on the lower eyelid can kind of push through. So this is a nice moment for us to use our pen to draw these lower eyelash or bottom eyelashes that kind of penetrate the watery structure that is the tears. Now at this point, how we're using our ballpoint pen is simply as a pencil to go over our current sketch, to emphasize details in the eye, the just normal details of the eye, such as the iris and pupil and detailing in the iris, as well as the eyeball itself, structures around the eyeball, and surrounding features of the eye. To further emphasize and contextualize this drawing, we can also start to add in some shading that flows along the upper eyelid, and this is where we can start bringing some three-dimensionality to the skin that also sits on top of the upper eyelid. We can play around with how we add in some contrast with the overlapping skin, and this is where we can create these subtle shadows and gradients that flow from that overlapping section of how the skin rests over the upper eyelid. We can also start sketching in the eyebrow itself, and this is obviously up to us in terms of how we like to form the eyebrow. We can make a more disheveled, bushy and unkept eyebrow, or we can create a more refined and manicured eyebrow. Obviously, eyebrows themselves are quite simple to draw in terms of how the details of the eyebrows are established, and this is basically these small little hairs that can be drawn as little strokes of lines that flow in a singular direction, and this tends to flow in the direction away or to the corner side of the face. So take your time with this aspect. Again, start to establish these details first with pencil if need be, and then slowly go over them with your pen. But at this point, you can continue adding in some shading with your ballpoint pen. You can continue working with your ballpoint pen to add in some details into the eyeball, but it is also important to know when to stop. We don't want to obviously overpower this eye drawing with too much shading, to the point where we darken the eye structure so much that there is a loss of these small tonal gradients and variations within the eye itself. And this is why it's really important to work with layers and build up layers of tonal value and shading, whether it's with your pencil or it's with your ballpoint pen. But there you have it, guys. This is the basic process of how to draw a teary eye or tears in the eye. Obviously, some things to take away. It's important to know how the water structure interacts with light, how it reflects light but causes shadow within the structure itself and shadowing on the surface that it sits on. Another thing to consider is just these very simplistic geometric structures that will be drawn as negative space in the eye itself, as well as in the tear-like structures. And this is going to represent reflections of light, and that's the main thing to take away. The idea is that we're trying to create a reflective, glassy, wet surface along the eyeball itself, as well as within the tear structures as well. Thanks, guys. Thanks for tuning in. I hope this was helpful. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. Otherwise, stay tuned for more, and see you next time.